Hello, and welcome to a presentation presented by myself, Daniel, and created by Sam, myself, Nishan, and Mitchell. This is IDEA and History and Context. Talking about IDEA, first there's the overview. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is basically broken down into several key parts. The first one being the zero reject policy, which is basically the concept that all students are basically given the right to public education regardless of the nature or severity of their disability. It also requires states to set up a system to find these students because you could, in a way, avoid the problem and create, in a sense, rejection by not looking for students who need these services. And it also covers things like suspension and expulsion policies on how schools can go about, if they have to, of removing a student from the school. The next one is the free and appropriate public education. That is a pretty broad statement that basically is broken down into some key points. First, free means that it cannot be at cost to the families who require these services covered under IDEA. Appropriate, it must meet the needs of the student, and we will talk about this a little bit more better later, since this is kind of one of the specific issues that runs into a lot of debate. Public, obviously, this kind of impacts public education. It is not specifically given to private education institutions. This is for public education. And then there's the next concept, which is least restrictive environment. This is basically the concept that students must be educated as closely to their non-disabled peers. That might mean in the general education classroom. The key thing is they should be given as much of the standard curriculum as possible, and they should not be restricted from access. Next two are non-discriminatory evaluation. This one covers the concept of keep making sure that when people are being, or students are being decided on whether or not they meet the criteria for IDEA, that it must make sure to avoid any discriminatory evaluation. Thus, language and certain other learning differences must be taken into account when evaluating students. And then finally, parent and family rights and procedural safeguards. Basically, parents have a right to confidentiality. They have a right to be consulted. They have to give their approval before a student can be admitted into testing for a disability. And also the procedural safeguards also come in to take care of when there's a difference of opinion between educators and parents. So how to identify students with disabilities. There is a specific model given in IDEA called response to intervention. It is a tiered model, basically requires scientifically proven methods to kind of validate any response to a lapse in learning. With the tiered basically process, there are three tiers. The first being kind of remedial education done in the general education classroom. The second tier is going to be a little bit more focused and in small groups and possibly some peer tutoring. And then finally, tier three will be a much more intensive daily, possibly one-to-one instruction, possibly in small groups, but outside of the general education classroom. The screening is to determine the nature, severity, and persistence of the disability. The nature being what is it that is blocking this student from learning? The severity, how much does it affect the student in their learning abilities? And then finally, persistence. Is this something that is intermittent? Is it something that is consistent? Those all have to be determined before a student can be placed in the IDEA's kind of concept of special education. So IDEA history is kind of broken into a few different key sections. Key kind of things built their way to the history of IDEA. The first being the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. which was kind of the first real push by the disabilities community to seek formal recognition that there was discrimination occurring in the general public. It was limited to just federally funded programs and mostly addressed only access issues. The next one that came up pretty much right after was the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1974. It was a precursor and laid the groundwork for a lot of what it was in IDEA that was brought out in 1994 and then reauthorized in 2004 to now present. The Rehabilitation Act, as I mentioned, was passed in 1973, and it had no administrative process to address and resolve violations. Individuals could take complaints straight to the court for violating the Rehabilitation Act, but there wasn't a system to really handle the actual issues. It was kind of just a first step. And as I mentioned, with the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, it was broken into some major provisions. And basically, with these provisions, they were broken down by states and schools. Districts must make every reasonable effort to identify handicapped children and give first priority to the most severely disabled. This was kind of the zero reject kind of policy that came out in the IDEA. They have to evaluate learning needs of each child in consultation with parents and special education advisors and develop an individual education program to meet their needs. This connects really to the point of making sure that parents are involved in the process. Another core piece, IDEA. The place each children in the least restrictive environment possible, well, that is directly connected to IDEA's least restrictive environment clause. Periodical evaluation of the children's progress and adjustment to the education program as needed. This really connects to the fact that with IDEA and the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, it was required that you would have to consistently check, and it is still to this day consistently required that students make sure they're being checked, that they are no longer subject to the same issues that originally got them into special education. They have to be checked on some periodical basis. Another important piece that came a little later than the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act was the Americans with Disability Act, also known as the ADA. Basically took the Rehabilitation Act and really built on top of it. It had 4 titles specifically addressing key areas that were necessary to make sure that people with disabilities were fully integrated into society. Obviously, still a long-term effort is still being applied to this day. Title I, mainly equal employment opportunity regardless of disability. Title II, prohibiting discrimination on the basis of disability in state and local services. Title III, prohibit private places, and this is a key one, a public accommodation from discriminating against individuals with disabilities. One of the major groups that this was targeted at was transportation, privately run transportation systems, that they had to now were required to make their systems accessible. Currently with IDEA, in the context of schools, there are issues, for example, with the free and appropriate education. First question is, what is considered appropriate? The Supreme Court said personalized instruction is being provided with sufficient supported services to benefit from instruction. So very specifically, but that even is still vague. What is benefit from instruction? Does that mean that students are going to get high grades? Are they going to pass standardized testing? There seems to be always some issues behind free and appropriate education, specifically when it comes to the appropriateness of it. Where is that appropriateness? Difficulties around LRE are that many schools don't have access to the resources to sometimes provide those least restrictive environments. For example, in one of the readings, one of the schools tried to totally integrate all of their classrooms, and while it did create a kind of in a way, a least restrictive environment, the readings went on to mention how teachers had to basically take into account all of these new students with special education needs that had individual education plans, IEPs, and they had to balance that out, and it became very difficult. And so, not having enough resources really leads to a fair amount of problems. The examples of kind of good examples and bad examples of environments that portrayed were in the movie like Deej. Deej showed a very positive example of creating a least restrictive environment. We saw him with his assistant in the classroom, assisting him with his communication, helping him stay in the classroom, kind of included both mentally and physically. And then we saw kind of a fictional account of Peanut Butter Falcon, where a individual with Down syndrome was put in a very restrictive environment. While it was completely non-educational and outside of kind of the IDEA construct, it is a good example, though, of how schools can sometimes really restrict students due to the fact of limited resources. Coming to kind of the end here, one of the last real key concepts in IDEA is this continuum of placement. And what happens here is students get placed somewhere on this bar here. And it's not so much that that is permanently where they are all the time. It is really about how much percentage of students' time. For example, in the Including Samuel movie, it's a great example of a student who had hospitalization at certain times, but was also very much included in the general education classroom. So in some way, you would find that his placement on here would not be totally integrated. It would be somewhere in the middle between totally integrated and isolated in a hospital or residential school. These are the important decisions that have to be made, is how much time are students being placed in self-contained classrooms, resource rooms. It's not so much that the student always is there, it's how much time are they out of the integrated environment of the general educated classroom. Bringing that all together with IDEA, it is important to remember that students are all individuals and that they all will fall somewhere on this graph, this line here, and that it is important to continue to ask these questions on whether what free and appropriate education is, what is the least restrictive environment, and even if RTI, the response to intervention, are adequately addressing student needs.